Ranger's Apprentice, Book 2, The Burning Bridge by John Flanagan. Chapter 25. Gillen slept like a log for 6 hours, totally exhausted in the tent where Holt had taken him. Throughout that time, he didn't stir once. His mind and body were shut down, drawing new strength from total rest. Then, after those 6 hours, his subconscious mind stirred and began to function, and he began to dream. He dreamed of Will and Horace and the girl, Evanlyn, but the dream was wild and confused, and he saw them as captives of the Wargals, tied together while the two robbers, Bart and Carney, stood by and laughed. Gillen rolled onto one side, muttering in his sleep. Holt, sitting nearby, repairing the fletching on his arrows, glanced up. He saw that the young ranger was still asleep and went back to his routine task. Gillen muttered again, then fell silent. In his dream, he saw the servant, Evanlyn, as the king had described her, with her hair long and uncropped, masses of it flowing down her back, thick and lustrous and red. And then he sat up, wide awake. "My God!" he said to a startled Holt. "It's not her!" Holt swore as he spilled the thick, viscous glue that he was using to attach the goose feather veins to the shaft arrow. Gillen's sudden movement had caught him by surprise. Now he mopped up the sticky liquid and turned with some irritation to his friend. "Could you give a bit of warning when you're going to start shouting like that?" he said peevishly. But Gillen was already out of the camp bed and hauling on his breeches and shirt. "I've got to see the king," he said urgently. Holt stood warily, not altogether sure that Gillen wasn't sleepwalking. The young ranger shoved past him, dashing out into the night and tucking his shirt into his trousers as he went. Reluctantly, Holt followed him. There was a slight delay as they reached the king's pavilion. The guard had changed several hours before, and the new sentries didn't know Gillen by sight. Holt smoothed things over, but not before Gillen had convinced him that it was vital for him to see King Duncan, even if it meant waking him from a well-deserved sleep. As it turned out, though, in spite of the late hour, the king wasn't sleeping. He and his supreme army commander were discussing possible reasons for the raids into Celtica, when Gillen, barefull, rumple-haired, and with several buttons still askew in his shirt front, was allowed into the pavilion. Sir David looked up in alarm at the sight of his son presented. "Gillen, what on earth are you doing here?" he demanded, but Gillen held up a hand to stop him. "Just a moment, father," he said. Then he continued facing the king. "Sir, when you described the maid Evanlyn earlier, did you say red hair?" Sir David looked to Holt for an explanation. The older ranger shrugged, and Sir David turned back to his son, anger clearly showing on his face. "What difference does that make?" he began, but again Gillen cut him off, still addressing the king. "The girl who called herself Evanlyn was blonde, sir," he said simply. This time it was King Duncan who held out a hand to silence his angry battlemaster. "Blonde?" he asked. "Blonde, sir. She'd cut it short, as I said, but it was blonde, like your own, and she had green eyes," Gillen told him, watching Duncan carefully and sensing the importance of what he was telling him. The king hesitated a moment, covering his face with one hand. Then he spoke, the hope growing in his voice. "And her build? Slight, was she? Smaller stature?" Gillen nodded eagerly. "As I said, sir, for a moment we could have taken her for a boy. She must have used her maid's identity, because she thought it was safer if she remained incognito." Now he understood those slight hesitations in Evanlyn's speech, and why she had a broader grasp of politics and strategy than most servants would expect to have. Slowly, Holt and Sir David began to realize the import of what was being said. The king looked from Gillen to Holt to David, then back to Gillen again. "My daughter is alive," he said quietly. There was a long silence. It was finally broken by Sir David. "Gillen, how far behind you were the two apprentices and the girl?" He hesitated. "Possibly 2 days' ride, father?" he estimated, following his father to the map table and indicating the farthest point that he thought Will and the others might have reached by now. Sir David took instant charge, sending messengers running to Rose, the command of the cavalry wing, and have him prepare a company of light cavalry to leave camp immediately. "We'll send a company of the 5th Lancers to bring them in, sir," he told the king. "If they leave within the hour and ride throughout the night, they should make contact sometime around noon tomorrow." "I'll guide them," Gillen offered immediately, and his father nodded assent. "I'd hoped you said that." He seized the king's arm, smiling with genuine pleasure at the relief on the tall man's face. "I can't tell you how pleased I am for you, sir," he said. The king looked at him, a little bemused. So recently he had been privately mourning the loss of his beloved daughter Cassandra. Now, miraculously, she had been restored to life. "My daughter is safe," he said almost to himself. Evanlyn crouched over the pile of wood beside the bridge railing. From time to time she heard the dull thrum of Will's bow as she fired at the approaching enemy, but she forced herself not to look up and concentrating on the job in hand instead. She knew they had one last chance to get the fight going properly. If she got it wrong this time, it would mean disaster for the kingdom. So she carefully stacked and placed the wood, making sure there was sufficient airspace between the pieces to allow a good draft. She had none of the shavings left to use for tinder this time, but only a few meters away she had a perfect source of fire. The right-hand cable was still blazing fiercely. Satisfied that the wood was stacked properly, she took Will's sacks and cut several 1-meter lengths of tarred rope from the bridge railing. Thinner length, not the massive cable itself. It would have been almost impossible to hack through that in time. Taking the rope lengths, she came to her feet and darted across the bridge to the blazing fire on the other side. It was a simple matter to get the lengths of the tarred rope burning. Then she ran back to her fire pile and draped the burning rope around the base, trailing it through the grasps she had left in the wood. The flames licked at her fingers as she pushed the rope in between pieces of wood. She bit her lip, ignoring the pain as she had made sure the fire was burning freely. The tar-fed flames cracked at the wood, flicked, then took. She fanned them for a few seconds as they became established, until the lighter kindling strips were burning fiercely. Then the heavier planks began to take fire as well. The handrail caught on several places, and now tongues of flame were shooting up the cable, beginning to lick at it, feeding on the tar, then running up where it joined the wooden pylon structure. Only now did she take the time to glance up at Will. Her eyes were dazzled by the fire, and she could see him only as a dull blur, 5 meters away, behind a rock outcrop. As she looked, he rose to a standing position and fired an arrow. She looked into the surrounding darkness, but could see no sign of the attackers. The bridge gave another convulsive jerk beneath her feet, and the roadway tilted to an alarming degree as the second of the 3 strands of the right-hand cable burned through and the structure sagged further to that side. They wouldn't have much time to get back across to where Horace and Tuck waited. She had to warn Will. Sack's knife in hand, she ran full pelt to where he crouched behind the rocks, her eyes searching the darkness for movement. He glanced quickly at her as she arrived. "The other side is burning. Let's get out of here." Grimly, he shook his head, then pointed with his chin to a jumble of rocks barely 30 meters from where they crouched. "Can't risk it. One of them has got behind those rocks. If we go now, we might have time to save the bridge." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a quick darting movement to the left and pointed quickly. "There's one," she said. Will nodded. "I see him," he replied evenly. "He's trying to draw my fire. As soon as I shoot him, the one closer to us will have a chance. I have to wait for him to show himself before I can shoot." She looked at him horrified as she realized the significance of what he was saying. "But that means the others can close in on us," she said. This time, Will said nothing. The incipient panic he had felt was now replaced by a calm sense of resolution. Deep in his heart, a part of him was glad that he hadn't failed Holt, and glad that he had repaid the faith that the older ranger had placed in him when he saw him as an apprentice. He glanced at Evanlyn for a long moment, and she realized he was willing to be captured if it kept the enemy away from the bridge just a few minutes longer. Captured or killed, she amended. Behind them there was a groan and crash, and she turned to see the first cable finally give way in a shower of flame and sparks. It took the burned through upper half of the pylon with it. That was the result they had wanted. They had discussed the idea of simply cutting the main cables, but that would left the major structure of the bridge untouched. The pylons themselves had to be destroyed. Now the entire bridge was hanging, suspended by the left-hand cable, and flames were already eating their way through that. In a few more minutes, she knew, the bridge would be gone. The fissure would be impassable once more. Will tried to give her a reassuring smile. It wasn't very successful attempt. "You can't do much more here. Get across the bridge while you still got time." She hesitated. desperately wanting to go, but unwilling to leave him on his own. He was only a boy, he realized, but he was willing to sacrifice himself for her and the rest of the kingdom. "Go," he said, turning to her and shoving at her. And now she thought she could see the glitter of tears in his eyes. Her own eyes filled, and she couldn't see him clearly. She blinked to clear vision, just in time to see a jagged rock curving down out of the firelit night. "Will!" she shouted, but it was too late. The rock took him in the side of the head, and he grunted in surprise. Then his eye rolls up, and he fell at her feet, dark blood already welling from his scalp. She heard a rush of feet from several directions, and she tossed the sacked knife aside and scrabbled in the dirt for Will's bow. Then she found it and was trying to knock an arrow, and when rough hands grabbed her, knocking the bow from her grasp and pinning her arms to the sides, the Scandians held her in a bear hug, her face pressed against the rough sheepskin of his vest, smelling of grease and smoke and sweat, and all but suffocating her. She kicked out, lashing with her feet and tossing her head, trying to butt the man who was holding her, but to no avail. Beside her, Will lay unmoving in the dust. She began to sob in frustration and anger and sadness, and she heard the Scandians laughing. Then another sound came, and they stopped. The arms holding her released a little, and she was able to see. It was a drawn-out, creaking groan, and it came from the bridge. The right-hand support was gone, and the left-hand side, already weakened by the fire, was now holding the entire structure. It was never meant for such a load, even in perfect condition. With a final sharp snap, the pylon shattered at its halfway point, and cables and all the bridge collapsed slowly into the depths of the fissure, trailing a bright shower of sparks behind it in the darkness. Chapter 26. Gillen watched impatiently as the company of cavalrymen remounted after a 15-minute break. He was itching to be away, but he knew that both horses and men needed rest if they were to continue the killing pace he had set them. They had been traveling for half a day, and he estimated that they should meet Will's party sometime in the early afternoon. Checking that all the troops were mounted, he turned to the captain beside him. "Alright, Captain, let's get them moving." The captain had actually drawn a breath to bellow his command when there was a call from the lead troops. "Horsemen coming!" An expectant buzz ran through the cavalrymen. Most of them had no idea what their mission was about. They'd been roused out of their bed in the early dawn and told to mount and ride. Gillen stood in his stirrups, shading his eyes against the midday glare, and peered in the direction the trooper had indicated. They hadn't reached the Celtic border yet, and here the terrain was open grasslands, with occasional thickets of trees. To the southwest, Gillen's keen eyes could make out a small cloud of dust, with a galloping figure at the head of it. "Whoever he is, he's in a hurry," the captain observed. Then the forward scout called more information. "3 horsemen!" came the shout, but already Gillen could see that the report wasn't quite correct. There were 3 horses, but only 1 rider. He experienced a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. "Should we send an interception party, sir?" the captain asked him. In times like these, it wasn't always wise to let a stranger ride full pelt into the middle of a group. But now that the rider was closer, Gillen could recognize him. More to the point, he could recognize the horse he was riding. Small, shaggy, barrel-chested. It was Will's horse, Tuck, but it wasn't Will riding him. The lead troop had already fanned out to stop the rider's progress. Gillen said quietly to the captain, "Tell them to let him through." The captain repeated the order with considerably more volume, and the troopers separated, leaving a path for Horace. He saw the small group of officers around the company banner, and headed for them, bringing the shaggy little ranger horse to a halt in front of them. The other horses, which Gillen now recognized as Horace's and the pack pony that Evanlyn had ridden, were following Tuck on the lead rope. They got Will!" the boy shouted hoarsely, recognizing Gillen among the group officers. "They got Will and Evanlyn!" Gillen closed his eyes briefly, feeling a lance of pain in his heart. Then, knowing the answers before, he said, "War girls? Scandians! They took them at the bridge, they—" Gillen flinched in surprise at the word. Surprise and horror. "Bridge? What bridge?" Horace was breathing heavily from his exertion. He'd alternated between the 3 horses, switching from one to the other, but not resting himself at any stage. He paused now to get his breath, realizing he should start from the beginning. "Across the fissure. That's why Morgoth took the Celts. They were building a huge bridge for him to bring his army across. They'd almost gotten it finished when we got there." The captain beside Gillen had turned pale. You mean there's a bridge across the fissure? He asked. The implications of such a fact were horrendous. Not anymore, Horace replied, his breathing steadier and his voice a little more under control now. Will burned it. Will and Evanlyn, but they stayed on the other side to keep the Scandians back and... Scandians? Said Gillen. What the devil are Scandians doing on the plateau? Horace made an impatient gesture at his interruption. They were the advance party for the forces that's coming up the southern cliffs. The Scandians were going to join forces with the Wargals across the bridge and attack the army in the rear. The group of cavalry officers exchanged looks. Professional soldiers, all of them, could imagine how disastrous that could have been for the royal forces. As well the bridge is gone then, said the lieutenant. Horace swung his tormented gaze on the officer, a young man barely a few years older than him. But they got Will! He cried, his eyes welling with tears as he thought of how he had stood by and watched helplessly as his friend was knocked out and carried away. And the girl, said Gillen, but Horace dismissed her. Yes, of course they got her, and I'm sorry she's been caught, but Will was my friend. You're sorry she's been caught? Do you know who... The captain was interrupted indignantly, for he was one of the few who knew the true nature of their task, but Gillen stopped him before he could say more. That's enough, Captain, he said crisply. The officer looked at him angrily, and Gillen leaned forward, speaking so that only he could hear. The fewer people who know who the girl's name is better, he said, and understanding dawned on the officer's eyes. If Morgoth knew that his men had held the king's daughter hostage, he would have a powerful tool to bargain with. Gillen looked back to Horace. Horace, is there any way they might be able to repair the bridge? He asked, and the muscular youth shook his head vehemently. He was devastated at the loss of his friend, but his pride in Will's accomplishment was obvious as he described it. No way at all. It's gone, well and truly. Will made sure that nothing remained on the far side. That's why he was caught. He wanted to make sure. He paused and added, They might get a small rope bridge across, of course. That decided Gillen. He turned to the captain. Captain, you'll continue with the company and make sure no bridge of any kind is thrown across the fissure. We don't want any of Morgoth's forces, no matter how small, coming across. Get Horace to show you the location on the map. Hold the south side of the fissure until you're relieved, and keep patrols moving either side to locate any other possible crossing points. There won't be many of those. Horace, you'll come with me and report to the king. Now. He stopped abruptly as he realized that Horace was waiting for a chance to say something. He nodded for the apprentice to go ahead. The Scandians? Said Horace. They're not just on the plateau. They're sending a force north of the thorn tree forest as well. There was another buzz of comment from the officers as they realized how close the army had come to disaster. 2 unexpected forces attacking from the rear would have left the king's men very hard-pressed indeed. You are sure of this? Gillen asked, and Horace nodded several times. Will overheard them talking about it. Their forces on the beach and in the fence are faint. The real attack was always going to come from behind. Then we don't have a moment to waste, said Gillen. That force in the northwest could still be a big problem if the king doesn't know about it. He turned to the company commander. Captain, you have your orders. Get your men to the fissure as soon as you can. The captain saluted briefly and issued a few crisp orders to his officers. They galloped off to their troops, and after a quick conference, while Horace pointed out the side of the fallen bridge on the map, the entire company was on the move, heading at a brisk canter for the fissure. Gillen turned to Horace. Let's go, he said simply. Warily, the young warrior nodded, then turned back to his mount. Tuck hesitated, pawing the ground as he watched the cavalry ride away, back toward where he had last seen his master. He trotted a few uncertain paces after the troop. Then at a word from Gillen, he reluctantly fell in behind the tall ranger. Chapter 27. Will's head ached abominably. A constant, rhythmic thudding pounded through his skull, setting flashes off behind his tight-closed eyes. He forced his eyes open and found himself staring close range at a sheepskin vest and at the back of a pair of leather-bound woolen leggings. The world was upside down, and he realized he was being carried over someone's shoulder. The thudding was the sound of the man's feet as he jogged along. Will wished he would walk. He groaned aloud, and the jogging stopped. Eric, the man carrying him called, is awake. And so, saying the Scandian lowered him to the ground, Will tried to take a pace, but his knees gave out and he sank to the haunches. Eric, the leader of the group, leaned down now and examined him. One thick thumb caught hold of his eyelid, and he felt his eye being opened wide. The man wasn't cruel, but he was none too gentle either. Will recognized him now as the Scandian who had come close to discovering him when he was eavesdropping by the campfire in the valley. He said forward. Concussed, most likely. That was a good throw with there, Nordal, he said to the one of the other. The Scandian he had spoken to a giant of a man, with his blonde hair in two tightly plaited braids. They was greased so they swept upwards like horns, smiled at the praise. Grew up hunting seals and penguins that way, I did, he said with some satisfaction. Eric released Will's eyelid and moved away. Now Will felt a gentle touch on his face, and opening his eyes again, found himself looking into Evanlyn's eyes. She stroked his forehead gently, trying to clean away the dried and matted blood there. Are you alright? She said, and he nodded, then realized that was not a good idea. Fine, he managed, fighting back a wave of nausea. They got you as well? He added, unnecessarily, and she nodded. Horace? He said, softly, and she put a finger to her lips. He got away. I saw him running when the bridge collapsed. Will sighed with relief. We did it then. We got the bridge? This time it was Evelyn's turn to nod. A smile even touched her lips at the memory of the bridge crashing into the depths of the fissure. It's gone, well and truly. Eric heard the last words. He shook his head at them. And no thanks you'll get from Morgoth for that, he told them. Will felt a chill of fear at the mention of the Lord of Rain and Night's name. Here on the plateau, it seemed somehow more ominous, more dangerous altogether, more malevolent. The Scandian glanced at the sun. We'll take a break. Maybe our friend here will be up to walking in an hour or so. The Scandians opened their packs and produced food and drink. They tossed a water bottle and a small loaf of bread to Will and Evanlyn, and the two ate hungrily. Evanlyn began to say something, but Will raised a hand to hush her. He was listening to the Scandians' conversation. What do we do now? Asked the one called Nordal. Eric chewed a piece of dried and cod, washed it down with a gulp of the fiery liquor he carried in a leather bottle, and shrugged. For mine, we get out of here as soon as we can. We only came here for the booty. There's going to be precious little of that now that bridge is gone. Morgoth won't like if we pull it out, warned the short, heavily built member of the party. Eric simply shrugged. Horace, I'm not here to help Morgoth take over Ireland, he replied. Neither are you. We fight for profit, and when there's no profit to be had, I say we go. Horace looked down at the ground between his feet and scratched in the dust with his fingers. He didn't look up when he spoke again. What about those two? He said. And Will heard a sharp intake of breath from Evanlyn as she realized the Scandian meant her and Will. We take him with us, said Eric, and this time Horace looked up from the dust where he was drawing census patterns. What good are they to us? Why shouldn't we just hand them over to the Wargulls? He asked, and the other mumbled their agreement. It was obviously a question that had been on their minds. They'd simply been waiting for someone else to bring it up. I'll tell you what good they are to us. First and foremost, they're hostages, aren't they? Said Eric. Hostages? Snorted the fourth member of the group, the one who so far hadn't spoken. Eric rounded upon him. That's right, Swingle. They're hostages. Now, I've been on more raids and in more campaigns than any of you, and I don't like the way this one's shaping up. Seems to me like Morgoth's been getting too clever for his own good, and all this false plans and building secret tunnels and planning surprise attacks with Hoff and his men coming from Thorn Tree Forest. Too complicated, and complicated isn't the way to go when you're facing people like the Arrowlands. Hoff can still attack around the Thorn Tree, said Swingle stubbornly, but Eric was shaking his head. He can, but he won't know that the bridge is gone, will he? He'll be expecting support that will never come. I'll wager Morgoth won't hurry to tell him. He knows Hoff would give it all away if he found out. Let me tell you, it'll be a toss of a coin to see which way the battle goes. That's the problem with these clever plans. You take away one element, and the whole thing comes crashing down. There was a short silence while the other Scandians thought about what he had said. A few heads nodded in agreement, and Eric continued. I'll tell you boys, I don't like the way things are shaping. I say we should take away the chance we get to Hoff's ship through the fence. Why not go back the way we came? Asked Svenwell, but his leader shook his head emphatically. And try to get down those cliffs again? More craft after us? No thank you. I don't think he'd take too kindly to desert us. We'll go along with him as far as 3-step pass, and once we're in the open, we'll head east for the coast. He paused to let this sink in, and we'll have these two as hostages in case the Airlins try to stop us. They're kids, said Nordal derisively. What good are they as hostages? Didn't you see that oak leaf amulet the boy is wearing? Eric asked, and instinctively Will's hand went to the oak leaf that swung around his neck. That ranger symbol. He's one of them, maybe some kind of trainee, and they look after their own. What about the girl? She's no ranger. That's right, Eric agreed. She's just a girl. But I'm not handing any girl over to the walkers. You've seen the way they're like. They're worse than animals, that lot. No, she comes with us. There was another moment as the other considered his words. Then Horace spoke. Fair enough, he agreed. Eric looked around the others and saw that Horace had spoken for them all. The Scandians were warriors and hard men, but they weren't totally ruthless. Good. Now let's get on the road again. He rose and moved toward Will and Evanlyn, while the other Scandians repacked the remains of the brief meal. Can you walk? He asked Will. Or does Nordal have to carry you again? Will flushed angrily and rose too quickly to his feet. Instantly he wished he hadn't. The ground heaved and his head swam. He staggered, and only Evanlyn's firm hand on his arm prevented him from falling. But he was determined not to show weakness in front of the captors. He steadied himself, then glared defiantly at Eric. I'll walk, he managed to say, and the big Scandian studied him for a moment, an appraising look in his eye. Yes, he said. I dare say you will.